Hi, my name is Adam Clemens, and I'm an assistant professor of scholar support and data services at the University of Mississippi.
In this video, I will demonstrate how to visualize Likert scale data with Tableau using the diverging stacked bar chart. Before I begin, though, I'd like to provide a little bit of background information about the Likert scale as well as the diverging stacked bar chart.
Rensis Likert, a social psychologist, is credited with developing the Likert scale. It is commonly used to measure user sentiment and inclination, and typically respondents indicate their level of agreement or disagreement on a 4 or 5 point scale, though this scale obviously can vary depending on your needs. Importantly, it provides a numerical way to present sentiment and is very common. It's likely if you've ever taken a survey or created your own survey, you have utilized this particular question type, the Likert scale. Regarding visualizing the sentiment and inclination that's collected through the Likert scale, a typical practice is to use the 100% stacked bar chart that you can see on your screen now. And it's each, in this case, with the 100% stacked bar chart, each shaded box represents a response category as a percentage of the whole. And so you can see those shaded categories here. And if you were to total these percentages, 24%, 36%, 15%, 11%, and 14%, that would equal 100. And then the same is true for each of these categories represented. And so the sentiment is represented here. And then you also have this dividing line on a 0% to 100% scale splitting the middle. Another option for visualizing Likert scale data or sentiment and inclination captured therein is using the diverging stacked bar chart approach. It retains the overall length of the bars, but shifts or diverges in the direction of the sentiment. And so you can see that shift or divergence here in this example of a diverging stacked bar chart. Whereas on the previous slide, you could see everything was uniform. With the diverging stacked bar chart, there is that divergence, hence the name. And so we still have the percentages. The area is essentially the same. It still totals 100%. But looking at this visualization visually, it is easier to determine the overall negative sentiment of a particular category and the overall positive sentiment. In this case, with Bounty, you can quickly see that there's more negative sentiment regarding that particular category than others. We're going to use Tableau, a popular data visualization software, to illustrate how to create a diverging stacked bar chart. I'm going to use sample dummy survey data for the purposes of this exercise, where I have 10 Likert scale questions amongst 11 survey participants. To begin with, I'm going to connect my data using Tableau. And so I've saved this in a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet. And so I'm going to navigate to where I have it saved and open it or connect it to Tableau. And once I've done that, you can see now that on the data connection page or the data source page, we now see that the data is connected here. And then we can see the 3 sheets within Tableau, or the tabs in Tableau in Excel are represented here. So to begin with, we're going to go ahead and move the first sheet, numerical responses, into the data pane here so that we can then see the table of information. Again, very similar to the same spreadsheet tabular interface of Excel. So we see response ID. And again, I mentioned the 10 questions. We've got those here all within the numerical responses. And each of these responses represent the Likert scale categories, in this case, response categories, beginning with strongly agree, which is represented by the number 5, agree, represented by the number 4, neither disagree nor agree, represented by the 3, disagree, represented by the 2, and then strongly disagree, represented by the 1. So again, this is just numerical responses. And again, one of the strengths of the Likert scale is it allows you to represent sentiment numerically. And so we have that here. But we've got 2 other categories here that we need, and we need additional information to get started. To begin with, we're going to need to move the demographic data. This is information about the survey participants. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to move it into this relationship pane, but this is the default for Tableau. In this case, we actually don't want the relationship. Instead, we want to create a join. So a relationship essentially just connects the data together. A join will actually merge. And what I mean by that, with the relationship, if you were to click on numerical responses, you then see the data in numerical responses in the sheet, and likewise with demographic data. But they're separate. They're just connected together. If you want to make a join, I'm going to remove this demographic out. If you want to join data in Tableau, what you'll need to do is after you've moved at least one sheet into the pane area, double click it, and then this will open the join pane. So now if we go back to demographic data and move it into this open space, you want to make sure that you're not dropping it into this orange area. You got to move just to the right of numerical responses, drop it in, and then you'll see this Venn diagram, and this indicates a inner join. In other words, it's connected based on at least one of these categories. And the category, now that we've made the join, you can quickly skim it and see, instead of having to click on each sheet, we can see all the data together, and it has been joined by this shared category response ID. That's a duplicate, so we're going to go ahead and hide one of them. We don't need two of those. Also, at this point, Tableau really doesn't like questions to be structured this way in individual columns. It prefers rather a database structure, in other words, a long column with all the question responses. So we're going to create a pivot. We're going to pivot all that question data into one long column. And thankfully in Tableau, it's easy to do. So you're just going to go in and select all the category or questions 1 through 10. Once you've done that, right click and you should see pivot. And now we've significantly reduced the number of columns in our data and instead made it much taller, which is really ideal for optimal visualization in Tableau. And we see those newly created pivot fields, pivot field name and pivot field value. So we have the questions and then the scores. And so we're actually going to rename each of those fields, but in this case, we'll rename pivot field name, right click it, go up to rename. We'll call it question ID. And then pivot field values we'll rename to scores or score. Okay. And then last step, we're going to make a second join. We want to now connect metadata with this data as well. And in this case, we get a red exclamation mark. That just means that we need to specify the connection itself. Which of these categories do we want to connect? So we need to identify the ones that are the same. So we've got question ID in our join data. We just created that or changed the name to question ID. And then also in the metadata, we have question ID. And it's not just a matter of the name. Obviously, you would want these to match up. And so question ID does from the metadata in this case. So now we should see all three of those sheets merged into one big sheet. So here's the metadata. Here remains some of the demographic data. And then we have the original numerical response data. However, since we joined this data based on question ID, we're going to have a duplicate field here, and we can go ahead and hide that second version. And I think we've got what we need. Okay, now that we have joined our three sheets together into one big table, we are ready to begin creating the calculations necessary for the visualization that we want to create, which is a diverging stacked bar chart. We're going to move over to sheet one. As I mentioned earlier, by default, Tableau has a number of different visualization options, including stacked bar charts, but there is no diverging stacked bar chart option. So that's why we're going to need to create some calculations on our own to build that visualization that we desire, which is a nice feature in Tableau. And so to get started, best practices really is to create what's called a crosstab. And this is just effectively going to be a table of numbers and calculations so that we can quickly see as we create, because we're going to create a total of 7 calculations. And so we'll get a good sense of the calculation step by step. And so that we can also, in case there's any issues, we can easily refer back to that crosstab and confirm or check for any errors and correct as needed. Okay, to get started, we're gonna go to our data pane here, and we're gonna drag the wording field to rows, and we're gonna drag score also to rows, and we have a visualization. In this case, bars. So each of these, we can see the wording, or in other words, the question itself. So in this particular sample dummy data, the question was, do you enjoy this particular exercise? Or I enjoy this particular exercise. And so the responses would be ranged from strongly agree to strongly disagree, again on a 5-point scale. And so we can see here that we've got the sum of those scores. And so what's happening here, if you hover over, you see the score for calisthenics is 25, climbing is 33. So what's happening here is, remember, if we go back to the data source with these questions, the score is, again, a numerical representation of that response category. So 4 in this case represents agreed. And so with the score, it's summing the total of those numbers for this particular question with calisthenics. And the total is 25, or climbing 33, so on and so forth. And at this point, again, if the Likert scales measure sentiment and inclination, naturally a component of that is either positive or negative sentiment. And negative sentiment in this case with the 5-point scale would typically be the strongly disagree or disagree, and positive sentiment would be agree or strongly agree. And since strongly disagree and disagree have the lower numbers associated, again, 1 and 2, it's reasonable to think or assume that with calisthenics, since we have a lower number, that overall there was a more negative sentiment towards this particular exercise. While it makes sense to us, this obviously would not make a lot of sense to someone just looking at the visualization, and we want to make this as easy to understand without having to provide a whole bunch of text. What we'd really like, rather than having Tableau sum or total up each of those responses into a total number, it would be better for Tableau to view those numbers, the scores themselves, as in the same way that it would view the text data itself. In other words, as individual discrete categories. And so to do that, we're going to change it, first of all, from a measure, which is quantifiable, to dimensions, which is more qualitative in nature. And then we'll change the continuous to discrete. And now we have that represented over here on the score column. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, and so the next step then, now that we have the score properly represented here, we want to next drag in the numerical responses. So we're going to get a sense of how many responses were provided for, or selections were made for each of those response categories. And so by dragging numerical responses from this particular data, I can see quickly that with calisthenics, again, the 1 being strongly disagree, 4 participants selected that, 3 selected disagree, so on and so forth. All right, so now we can quickly see the numbers associated with each of these response categories. It would help, though, rather than having the numerical values here, to instead have the text value. In other words, the response categories themselves. And so to do that, we're going to make our first calculation. We're going to go to analysis, and then create calculated field. And we'll call this answer. And we're going to create a simple case statement. And then we will input score. And when 1, then strongly agree, or sorry, strongly disagree. It would really throw our sentiment off. All right, so then strongly agree, and notice that I have it in quotation marks, and the text now is shaded gray. When 2, then disagree, and I bet you can get the rest together. When 3, then neither agree nor disagree. When 4, then agree. And when 5, then strongly disagree, or strongly agree. Okay, and now we've completed all of those expressions. Now you'll notice this filter, the calculation contains errors. If you see that, you can click on it. Oftentimes it'll tell you exactly what's wrong. So we need an end statement is expected at the end. So we're going to do that now, and that should fix the problem. It is the calculation is now valid. And so once we hit OK, we'll see that new calculation is added to our data pane. And so we have answer that we could drag over. And in this case, we're actually going to, if you hover over score, we're going to kind of insert it into the score. And that will replace the numerical values with the answer values, the newly created answer values, again with that case statement, identifying if 1, then strongly disagree, so on and so forth. However, notice how now the order is alphabetical as opposed to chronological. We need to sort, though, based on that original score, because we want them to match the same way that you would expect to see them in a Likert scale survey question. So to do that, we're going to go up to answer, a little drop down arrow. We're going to go into sort, and we're going to change it from data source order, just in this case, alphabetical, to field. We'll leave it ascending. And rather than numerical responses, we're going to base it off of the score. And rather than the sum, we're going to do the minimum. And so that's going to change it back to what we had originally. Okay, now that we have created our first calculation answer and have replaced the numerical values with the answers themselves, and we have the numerical responses here for each. The next step is we, again, because of the positive and negative sentiment and the way that diverging stack bar charts work as a visual aid, we really want to be able to establish negative sentiment or positive sentiment. In this case, we're going to focus on the negative sentiment. And we'll need, there are several steps involved in terms of calculations to get to that. But to begin with, we're going to need to, first of all, identify or tell Tableau what constitutes a negative score in our particular data, in this case with the Likert scale data. So we're going to create a calculated field, our second one. We're going to go back up to the analysis, create calculated field. In this case, we're going to call this calculated field negative score. And we're going to use an if statement. So we're going to do if, and let's see, score less than 3 than 1. So, and I'll explain this in a moment and how this is going to work. Right? But the first statement is if score less than 3 than 1, else if score equals 3, then 0.5, else 0. And once again, we need that end statement to close it out. And so that should validate our calculation. And it has been validated. Okay. So what this calculation is doing is telling Tableau, first of all, identify which of the response categories are negative. And then it will ultimately help us when we get to the visualization with the diverging stack bar chart to visualize the number of responses below that dividing line. So that 0 average line right down the middle. And so if, in essence, if a score is less than 3 than 1, that means not the total scores here, these, the ones that were the counted numerical responses, but instead the numbers behind these response categories. So again, strongly disagrees 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so 1 and 2 are less than 3. So that means they're going to be take the total response or total selections in this case and multiply that total selection by 1. Same with disagree, 3 times 1. And that's going to give us the negative score for those two. And then if it's equal to 3, in this case, then neither agree nor disagree is 0.5. And the reason is on a 5-point scale or any odd numbered scale with Likert scales, you're going to have that kind of neutral response category that it's unknown whether or not the sentiment is positive or negative. So the simplest solution is to divide or to split it down the middle. And so that's why we're going to multiply it by a half, basically. And so 2 times 0.5 will be 1. And then any of the other numbers, in this case, 4 and 5, will be 0. And I'm going to go ahead and hit OK and then show you this. Hopefully that'll make a little more sense. So we're going to take negative score and we're going to drag it into this open area until you see that rectangle, long rectangle. Now we have 2 columns. We have the original count here for each of these response categories. And now we have the negative scores. Again, if you think back to that calculation, if less than 3, then multiply by 1 to get the negative score. If equal 3, then multiply by 0.5 to get the negative score. And then if anything else, then multiply by 0, which is going to be 0, which those will establish basically the positive scores. So with this particular question with calisthenics, we have a negative score of 4, 3, and 1. So that's a total of 8. For climbing, the negative score, if you add these together, 3, 4, 5, so on and so forth. Now, speaking of that, that's what we need. We can total these up ourselves, but obviously we need to set up a calculation telling Tableau to also total the negative scores. So the next step will be to create another calculated field. analysis, create calculated field, and we're going to call this one total negative score. And first step will be to create a total statement. And within that parentheses, we're going to do the sum of negative score. All right, just a simple calculation summing up the total number of negative scores. And then before we hit OK, let's change this default table calculation from automatic. We want to make sure that it's calculating based on the answer, which again is the underlying calculation for our visualization, specifically those numbers that we created earlier. Okay, so we're going to hit OK there, and that's going to default it to answer. And then we'll drag the total negative score into this area. And now we should see a new column created and representing that total negative score. Now they're going to be in each of the rows here for each question, but you can disregard all but one of those. Effectively, the total negative score for each question has already been assigned. Okay, now that we have our total negative score calculated, the next step is to create the total score calculation. So again, not just the negative, but the total. And so effectively totaling up each of the responses for each response category. So 4 plus 3 plus 2 plus 1 plus 1 equals 11. We want that represented as well, because that's going to form the basis of some of the percentages and calculations we're going to do next to really get at building and properly sizing the diverging and establishing the offset of the diverging stacked bar chart. So once again, we're going to go up to analysis and create calculated field. And in this case, we're going to call this calculation total score. And the calculation is going to be similar. We're going to do a total statement with count rather than sum this time, because the numerical response which we're going to use is count as opposed to a sum. So we're just going to do the count and then numerical responses. If you were to do sum, you would just get an error, but the results will be the same. Okay, so we've got, in this case, we've got 2 open parentheses, so we need to make sure we have 2 closed parentheses, and that's it. The calculation is valid. We also, like before, we want to make sure that we're doing the calculation or computing the calculation based on not an automatic, but an answer. And again, going back to the numerical values that underline those answers. So we've adjusted that. We've now got that as a value in our, or a field in our data pane. So we're once again going to drag it into the visualization. And we have established now a 4th column. And you can see if you were to total each of these question responses up, you would get 11. And in our case, we have very clean data. Again, it's a sample dummy survey data. There were 11 participants, and all 11 participants completed the survey by answering all 10 of the questions. So the total score, effectively the total responses, are 11. Okay, and again, these both negative score and total score are going to are needed to calculate percentages and size of bars, et cetera. And you'll see more of that in just a moment. So now that we have the total negative score and total score calculated, we next need to create a calculation that will establish that the starting point for the diverging stacked bar chart, again, to differentiate between the 100% stacked bar chart, which are fill up the entire space. And you can see that on this visualization here with 100% stacked bar chart, where it expands from the full range is 0 to 100%. And so there's no blank space, essentially. Whereas with the diverging stacked bar chart, again, because of the divergence, the offset, there is. And so the next step for us is we need to create a calculation that's going to tell Tableau where to begin these visualizations. So the far reaches of that visualization. So in this case, we could just barely make that out probably, but let's say that's like 30%, negative 30%, or in this case, yeah, negative 30%, as you can see the 0% there being the dividing line. So that's what we're going to need to create next. And to do that, we're going to create a relatively simple calculation, and we're going to call it Gantt start. So we're going to go to analysis. We're going to create a calculated field, and we're going to call it Gantt start. And if you're not familiar with Gantt charts, the very much look like the diverging stacked bar chart, but they're primarily used in work productivity and workflow And so that's hence the name Gantt. And so, but that's again, we're going to get the starting position of our diverging stacked bar chart. To do that, we're going to do, first of all, we're going to add the negative sign and then total negative scores or negative score divided by total score. So as I said earlier, that was the reason we needed to make those two calculations with the negative score and total, or sorry, total negative score and then total score so that we can create our, in this case, starting point, and then also we'll use them later for sizing. Okay, so just confirming we have a valid calculation here with negative and then the total negative score divided by the total, not the total negative score. That's a good thing I double checked. Total score. And yeah, we should be good now. No need to change any calculations. So we have Gantt start, and we're going to now drop this into the either here or now we can drop it into this measure values, and that'll add us I guess a fifth column. We have now created a fifth column. We need to convert this to a percentage just to be cleaner. And I'll open up that calculation again and explain what is happening. I mean, it's a fairly simple one, like I said, but just in case. But to begin with, we're going to select, hover over, and you'll see a little drop down arrow, Gantt start. We're going to format it away from the automatic number default, and then be sure that you're in the pane. And we're going to change it to percentage, and then we'll specify. It's up to you. I like one decimal place. So in this case, now we can see the Gantt start is negative 72.7, negative 45.5. And if we go back here with this, the diverging stacked bar chart now, again, negative 73, negative 45, that's going to establish the starting point for each of those diverging stacked bar charts. And the calculation, again, is pretty simple. And if you want to view any of your calculations, if you just right click the calculation and then go to edit, that will bring back up the calculation. So we're telling Tableau in this case for each of these questions, take the total negative score, in this case 8, but we're negating it, right? We're making it negative 8 divided by 11. If you were to calculate negative 8 divided by 11, you would get 72.7, and so on and so forth. So it repeats for each of the questions, obviously. And so we've established, again, the starting point. So now that we've established where each bar will need to start, the next step is to determine the size of each of the bars, respectively, that represent each of these response categories. And the simplest way to do that will be to divide the numerical responses. So this category here, or sorry, this column here divided by the total scores to get those respective percentages. And so to do that, once again, we'll go up to analysis, create calculated field. And in this case, we're going to call it percent total sizing. So the total size of each bar. And we'll do count because we're going to use numerical responses divided by total scores. All right, we're going to make sure that our calculation is valid. Is hit OK. And now we have percent total size, which we're also going to add to the measure values. And we see an additional new column created. We need to convert that to a percentage as well. So to do that, again, as a reminder, format, make sure that you're in the pane, not the axis. Numbers from automatic, we want to change that to percentage, and then 1 decimal place for consistency. If you prefer 2 or 3, just be consistent. And so now we've converted those to percentages. This is, again, you don't see the negative at all here, even though this is going to be, a negative category, obviously, response category. We're just establishing the size of each of those bars. So if you look at this visualization, again, the size of each. So in that case, 36%, 40%, 50%, so on and so forth. So it's helping determine, or Tableau to determine, the size of each respective bar. The next step will be to effectively establish the starting point for each of those individual bars, to draw individual Gantt lines or lines around each bar. And this will particularly help with color correction so that there's no bleeding or overlap, so that Tableau knows not only the size or the width of the bars, but also where they start and stop on our scale or in our visualization. And to do that, we're going to need to create relatively, but comparatively speaking, at least of the calculations we've made so far, this will be the most complicated one, and I'll explain it momentarily. But we're going to go back to analysis, create calculated field, and we'll call this Gantt percent. And I'm going to put the calculation in, and then I'll come back and run it, and then I'll explain it. I think it's easier to explain once you see how it operates. Okay, so the calculation is previous value, and then Gantt start, again, using one of those calculated fields that we used earlier, plus Zn for zero null, and I'll explain that momentarily. Lookup percent total sizing or size, comma, -1. And again, I'll explain all this in a moment, but before I click OK, I want to, again, make sure that it's valid. Opened parentheses have corresponding closed parentheses. So yes, we are good. Lastly, we do want to convert that from an automatic computation to tabulated based on answer. Change that. Okay. And we now have Gantt percent. Okay, so I'm going to drop this into the visualization and then reopen the calculation to explain. All right, so we've got Gantt percent here. Let's convert it to a percentage. Once again, decimal. Okay. It's a little bit different than the percent total size, and you do see some negative values there as well. So let me explain how this is working or what the intended function is here. So we're going to go to Gantt percent to view the calculation. We'll hit edit, and now we can see it. I'm going to also open a calculator once again. So hopefully that will help as we do some calculations to illustrate. Okay, so first of all, we've got previous value here. If you'd like to view definitions or understand any of these values, as I think I've mentioned earlier, simply come here, expand that, and then you can search the various. So with previous value, it's a table calculation that looks for the previous value in this case, again, what we've created, Gantt percent. So let me minimize this. So previous value is saying, okay, go to that and then take the previous value, but for the first response category in each of our questions, right, here, there is no previous value. So in that case, it's the Gantt start is saying if there is no previous value, then pull the value from Gantt start. And so that's what's happening here. So in this case, let me open back my calculation. This part of the equation is basically previous value starting here. There is no previous value. So we're going to take -72.7 and then the plus, and then we'll add the second part of the calculation. So the zero null is basically an expression that replaces null values with zero, and it can be particularly helpful to prevent errors or issues related to null values. So in this case, it's going to come in handy in those instances where we have a zero value or a null value, basically, in the second part of the equation. With the lookup expression, this is basically saying return a value of an expression in a specified row. And in this case, we're specifying the percent total size. And then the negative one actually is not really part of the calculation. It's rather doing similar work to what previous value is. It's saying go to the row that precedes that identified or target value. So look up, go to percent total size. So we're in percent total size. And in this case, again, we're starting here. So, but it wants us to go one row up. And once again, there's no value there. That's where the zero null comes in. So rather than having a null, we have a zero. And so, but that's it. We're not going to, pull from another row or column like we did in the first half of the equation. So long story short is our equation is going to look like this: -72.7 for the first half, and then we have a zero for the second. And so -72.7 plus zero equals -72.7. So that's how it'll work for each of these, the first response categories. Essentially, they strongly disagree because it starts or the beginning of that question. And then the four remaining response categories will work like this. So the previous value, in this case, again, if we're coming to -36.4, the previous value is -72.7. So we don't need to go to the Gantt start this time. We'll just go -72.7 plus And in this case, 0, null, we're going to look up and we've specified a target column and row. We're already at the row 27.3, but again, go to the preceding row, and that is 36.4. So 36.4 equals negative 36.3. Assume if I move the decimal places out, we would see something different. I'm not sure exactly why we have negative 36.3 or negative 36.4. But that is how that works. And then as one final example, if we come down to the third one here, again, we're starting negative 9.1. This is our previous value, but again, we want to go back to this, the value that preceded it, which is negative 36.4. And plus, again, look up to this specified target percent total size here, but we want to go to the preceding row, which is 27.3 equals negative 9.1. Okay, so that concludes the calculations and the creation of the crosstab here. Let's go ahead and change the title here to crosstab. We'll rename it crosstab. And now we're ready to create our diverging stack bar chart. So to do that, we're going to open up a new sheet. And we'll begin by moving or dragging the question or wording, changed it to question to the rows. And we'll move the Gantt percent to the columns. And immediately we have an error, but that's okay. In this case, that's what the red represents. If you were to click on that or hover over it, you'll see the error. The Gantt percent table calculation requires a field that is missing from the view, and it tells you exactly what to do. Add the answer field to the view to resolve. Now, remember, we calculated or computed many of the calculations based on answer, and so that's the problem is we don't have answer in the view yet, or this visualization area. So we need to resolve that issue. In order to resolve that issue, we need to add answer to the visualization area. You could drop it here or really anywhere in here, but I'm going to add it to color out of the start just to add color to the visualization. Next step is though we want to change this from automatic to Gantt bar. And so that's going to create those starting lines that we talked about earlier, right? So we're getting one step closer, but the next thing is we also want to get this in that, again, that same numerical order that we mentioned earlier, in the same way that you would expect to see this if you were participating or responding to a Likert scale question. In other words, strongly disagree to strongly agree. So to do that, we're going to go to answers once again, sort, and just like we did before, we're going to sort by field, make sure that it's ascending. Rather than sort by answer, we're going to sort by score, and rather than sum, we're going to sort by minimum. And we now should see that chronologically displayed again with the numerical values that are underlining each of these answers. Okay, so that looks good. And so you can, again, if you were to look quickly here, you can kind of see those percentage values that we established earlier on the axis here. Okay, so we want to fill these in though, right? We don't want to just have the markers. We want to have the full width and range and size of each of the bars. And so to do that, we're going to pull now our calculated field percent total sizing, and we're going to drop it into the size marks card. And so that's going to, again, look like what we would expect with a diverging stacked bar chart. The default for Tableau in terms of color is often this sort of color palette, which is intended to be very distinct and separate to help distinguish between categories or response categories or fields. What I would recommend though is something similar to what I have here. In this case, it's from the colorblind color palette, but really just any sort of color that is distinguishable or that I think illustrates the divergence itself, right? So we have a darker orange to lighter orange, darker blue to lighter blue, and then the neutral middle, which is divided, is a gray. Again, it helps us kind of establish the not only the neutrality, but also the positive sentiment and the negative sentiment and the degrees and scales of both. So that's what you see represented here. We do need to fix a few things. Right now, we're basically on a negative 80% to 100%. Let's go ahead and change that instead to negative 100 to 100, just for uniformity. So to do that, we're going to right-click on the axis, and we'll come down to under range, custom, and we'll just do -1 to 1. And that's going to make some slight changes, but that's definitely where we need to be. Okay, there are a few other minor things that we can do here. First of all, we may want to make this a little bit bigger so that we can see. Okay, so we want to make this a little bit bigger so that we can see the visualization more easily. So to do that, we're just going to come up to standard entire view. That'll enlarge it. You can also do some additional kind of aesthetic design choices here with your colors. Not only change the color, but also you can add borders, which I always like to do. I think it helps to just makes the visualization look nicer. And then lastly, if you wanted to add some labels here, you could do that. So again, if we go to percent Gantt percent and drag it into the label marks card this time, we'll see that. Once again, though, we're going to have to convert these to percentages. So we know how to do that already. Right click, format, and make sure we're in the pane. And we'll go down to percentage and negative or one decimal place. All right, but still, they're just on the opposite ends of the bars. We want them to actually be within each bar respectively. And so to do that, we're now also going to select, I'm going to close this out, select label, and you'll see lots of more options with labels. Including you can change the font type, size, etc. But we're going to focus on the alignment. If we're going to make the horizontal alignment center, and so that's going to bring out position. I think what we want with the labels, show the percentage size of each bar. And in this case, you see this one in particular, it's invisible because it's not quite large enough to accommodate the numerical value. If you want for that to appear, just be sure that you check the allow labels to overlap other marks. And so now you can see it there. One final step, we've created the diverging stacked bar chart, but my preference is to also show the average score for each question and any kind of Likert scale response that I have. And to do that, we need to effectively create a separate visualization and then we'll combine them into one. And so we're going to stay in this visualization pane or on this sheet, but we're going to drag score to the columns. And you'll see that that's going to generate effectively a separate visualization. And so the default is basically to match what we already have because we're using it in the same sheet. And notice also we have now distinct marks cards that we can select. So this is Gantt percent, which is this visualization. You could change the name if you wanted. And then this, it represents this visualization. So we want to make sure that we're in the correct marks card, and we're going to move all of the fields that we added earlier. So we just got these gray markers right now. And again, this is the score. So sum right now, but let's change that to average. So to do that, we're going to, again, drop down arrow and go down to measure. And then rather than sum, we'll select average, make some slight changes there. Change this from the Gantt bar, which is why we see those lines. You can change this to different types of shapes. My default typically is the circle. And I want to make a color that's going to stand out a bit. So I'll change it to yellow. The border, again, because it kind of borrowed what we've already done in the previous visualization. We have that there. That's good. And then we probably want to make those a little bit bigger, especially because we're actually going to add labels or the average score into those. So we'll stop there and see if that's enough space. Okay, so we've got the average scores here represented by each of the yellow circles. Let's add labels there. And so to do that, we're just going to add score to the label. Again, we're not pulling from up here, we're pulling from our data pane. So we'll once again change that to average. And we have 3 decimal places. Let's move that down to 2. So we'll go format, pane, number, and we'll need to go to number custom, and that'll get us to the 2 or whatever your preferences are. So we've got the averages in each question now represented in the visualization. And like before, we could change other aspects, but for now, we'll leave it like that. And as I mentioned earlier, these currently are separate. We want to combine them in a dual axis. And to do that, we'll just go up to average score and the column and select dual axis. And that's going to combine them. But we're not quite there yet. You notice that you would expect the average scores, these circles, to be within the bars, but they're not. And that's because we have 2 separate axes here. And you can see that's because we have separate values, negative 100 or negative 1 to 1. And up here we have negative 4.5 or negative 5 to 5, really. But we know that this score, this is a 5-point scale, right? 1 to 5. So we're going to edit this axis so that it reflects that accurately. And so once again, rating column, and we'll just do 1 to 5. And that should resolve that issue. And it does. So now we can quickly see the averages. And you'll see in some cases, we've got some overlapping numbers. I'll show you how to fix that. But first, let's remove our axis, really both axes. I'm going to go down to the bottom axis and uncheck show header. That'll remove both of them, gives us a little bit more space, but still, in any case that you see where you have overlapping labels, if you want to move the label from the bar, be sure to select in the bar. If you want to move the label in the circle, be sure to select the circle. Of course, we want the labels to stay in the circles, right? And so we have a little bit more room to play around with in the bars. You can do that. And in some cases where you don't have the space in the bar, you may have to just minimize or make the text size a little bit smaller as well. But we can quickly adjust these. We've got plenty of space. Looks like we should have space here, maybe pretty close. But yeah, you can, kind of clean up your visualization as you see fit. But again, the idea here being that now we have a diverging stacked bar chart that represents each of the response categories. And then we also have the average score. So we can quickly see that in this case with calisthenics, as we suspected from the very beginning, it was in terms of sentiment, the most negative, and the average score represents that too on a 5-point scale, negative 2.27. And so on and so forth, with the more positive. And so you can quickly, by looking at this, I think, get a sense of calisthenics being the least popular and swimming and walking being the most popular. Depending on your data, you can also filter this data based on other demographic information, for instance, based on gender. If you add gender there, move it behind question, and then we can filter if you just want to look at, say, women. We can do that, and now we'll see the results. And that concludes my demonstration for visualizing Likert scale data with Tableau. If you have any questions, please let me know. My name is Adam Clemens. I'm again, an assistant professor of scholar support and data services at the University of Mississippi. My email address is jaclemon@oldemiss.edu. Thanks for watching.